Greg is the Secretary of Effective Outcomes Australia, helped found EAA Environment, and is the CEO of Good Ancestors Policy. At Good Ancestors, he works to translate EA ideas and research into policy change at the state and federal levels. Good Ancestors has worked on a range of issues from catastrophic disasters and food security to AI safety and ocean. Previously, Greg was a public servant where he held senior positions related to managing catastrophic risk, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session, so you've got on the swap card app to put them through that and upload the questions you like. Otherwise, swap great.
I'm going to be anchored on this side of the room because the range of the clicker is only about 1 meter. So like, I apologize to people on the far side who have now joined the back row, but that's all right. Let me know if you can't hear me very clearly with the mic. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. So 15 years of public service experience that we're trying to translate into sort of advocating for good. So I just wanted to start, I gave that sort of slide last night with those sort of arrows talking about like how political capital can be spent on the causes that we think are most impactful for people who made it last night. But I guess I wanted to give like another quick sort of like heuristic for thinking about these problems, right? So throughout my career, I've sort of been studying like how do you solve hard problems? And you solve it with these steps, right? So you have a principle, there's kind of like a guide of what you're trying to achieve, and then you track that through logical steps to a procedure that kind of like makes a difference in the world, right? So what does that mean? Let's think about like traditional effective altruism. So the lives of people far away have equal worth to those who are close by, right? So this is the Peter Singer insight, a great principle, one that's changed my life and perhaps one that's changed the lives of many people who are here. So like what policies flow from that, that we should be implementing the most cost-effective health interventions that we can find, right? Sensible policy, and then that leads to a practice. And that practice is that we should distribute treated bed nets to high-risk areas. So, and then ultimately you have these procedures which are like we can manufacture them in this way, and then we can put them on trucks in this fashion, and we can train people in their use in these ways. So what we've done with like EA 1.0 is we've tracked principles all the way through to procedures that have this like really high impact in the world. And so this is like just a great example of like a great way of solving a hard problem. But as we sort of take that through to like the Will MacAskill insight, right? So the lives of people in the future have moral worth. And again, like that comes through to, that comes through to a policy, which is like stopping extinction would be a good thing to do, or like making social society last and have good values would be a good thing to do, to implement, like to affect the future. But I think this is kind of where it gets ropier for long-termism, right? Like it's harder to think like, what's the bed nets of long-termism? I don't think that problem's like clearly answered yet. And so what I want to argue is that persuading governments to enact high-impact policies is the bed nets of long-termism. So we can have this sort of well-coordinated, national, globally coordinated policy advocacy that argues for particular things, but these high-impact policies to persuade governments to think, to pursue our long-termist causes. And this is the space that Good Ancestors is trying to operate. And I think that this is the kind of space that we could be exploring in these kinds of communities around the world. So I said this last night again. So this is in an absolute nutshell what we're trying to do for people who are new to Good Ancestors. So we advocate, by which I mean we Good Ancestors advocate, but also we help you to be a voice for your own views and values for these high impact policies, which is kind of like all the kinds of things that we care about as preventing pandemics or preventing nuclear wars or helping animals, all of these things that matter a lot, to sort of empower leaders and to direct leaders to tackle these problems. So I put up this little silly cartoon. So we've got Superman here, he has all kinds of capability and he has capacity. He wants to go fight a monster, but the problems that he's facing are these big structural problems. And these are perhaps the things that EA has been criticized for neglecting. And this is getting to the point of what we want to address, right? So what is policy might be one of the thoughts that you've got in your head from that opening blurb. So I guess in like a technical way, policy is the framework behind the laws of parliament and the decisions that executive government makes. So if you think about something like cigarette plain packaging, like the policy there is that we're going to put cigarettes in green boxes and they're going to be behind sliding doors in supermarkets. And there's going to be like regulators who enforce those laws. Like, so that's what we mean by policy. And policy advocacy is the lawful and transparent way of advocating for those policies. So it's not some sort of like backroom nefarious dealing. It's using democracy in the way democracy is intended to be used, right? Like this is the point of living in democracy, is that you get to argue for the ideas that you think are important. So using that cigarette plain packaging example, like the Cancer Council of Australia led that work. They found allied groups around Australia, like parent groups and other health groups, to argue for this policy, and eventually got it implemented. So it's my view that governments are the key players in most of these high impact cause areas. Like they're the ones who are setting the rules by which we're playing. They've got a lot of money and people in power in the game. And I think that the Australian government is wealthier than most governments. I mean, you can measure that, and is also more influential than most governments. So again, with that cigarette plain packaging example, those plain packages have gone on to be implemented in countries, I think, on every continent. Dozens of countries have now followed what we did, not because of some hard power requirement, like we didn't tell them to do that, but they saw us doing it, they thought it was good, and they did the same thing that we did. So getting the Australian government to do something good has this sort of global leadership effect. And there's also hard power requirements, right? So we've got to vote in the United Nations, we've got to vote in the World Health Organization, that's other sort of part of the influence. So what issues do we target? So Good Ancestors is not a single issue organization. We're sort of looking for those opportunities to tackle those world's most pressing problems wherever we find them. So if you look at the American ecosystem, there's like a space governance organization and an AI safety organization and a pandemic prevention organization. I don't think we've necessarily got the scale in this community to do that yet. But I guess I'd just add that I think one of the things we talked about last night is how important alliances and working together are. And again, with that Cancer Council example I was giving, it wasn't Cancer Council that secured plain packaging. It was Cancer Council building an alliance of aligned organizations. And I think that's absolutely critical. So I'm going to give like 3 points here that's going to frame the rest of the talk, right? So what topics have the biggest impact is a guiding light. So you've got to have values to decide what impact means. So I'll give you 3. So those values are future generations. So we care about the future. I think you can have a great argument about like whether it's 10 years or 1 million years into the future that you should care about. I think for policy advocacy, that doesn't really matter. Like if you're talking to government and you're thinking sort of more than 1 or 2 terms into the future, like that's the future. So although you could haggle about that, I don't think it necessarily matters for this purpose. We care about all conscious creatures. And we care about evidence-based reason, right? So those are the 3 values that are informing what we think impact means in this context. So the second question we're asking ourselves is there a policy window? Like, is there a chance to get something done on this issue at this time? So to give an example of what we mean by that, there was this big Australian conversation you would have all seen about sort of boats arriving in Australia, and there was a big wrestle between the 2 major parties about like what the policy should be on that, and there was a policy window to make that change. We've now moved into a situation where the 2 political parties have wedged each other to oblivion at that point, and no one wants to talk about it. So there used to be a chance to talk about that issue, whereas now there isn't. Or to take a different example, if you want to talk about Voice, Truth and Treaty, like now's a great time to be talking about that issue, but after the vote, it's going to be really, really hard to talk about that issue. So these policy windows, they come and they go, and sort of like following the tempo of them is important to succeeding in this space. And then this third idea is, can we be a significant voice in the conversation? So if you take these sort of big, fraught issues, you might not have a significant voice in the conversation, whereas if we pick sort of more neglected issues, maybe we can be. So I guess to give an example of something that I think might weave the first 2 questions, but get stuck in the third, like, so if you think about AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK nuclear submarine deal, like that probably does have a big impact. Like it relates to great power conflict, it's a big question. There's a policy window right now because this is kind of a Liberal Party treaty that then the kind of Labor Party has inherited, and it's like a bit of an awkward fit with their values. So there might be a chance of change. But I think it's hard for us to be like a significant voice in that conversation because there's these sort of, you know, multi-billion-dollar defense industrial corporations running around. And although I think we do have a significant voice, like maybe we're not playing in that league, so it's like a harder question for us to tackle. So have in mind those 3 questions because we're going to come back to those issues as we move forward. So how do we achieve policy change? 3 things. So this first one is evidence-based policy. I think the fact that we can maneuver across that entire space of important issues to find the things where the evidence is clear makes our job like dramatically easier over someone who is given an advocacy agenda by a funder, right? So if you're, you know, Telstra and you've been told you're the policy people in Telstra and you need to advocate for increased regulation because we don't want Vodafone to expand their network. So you've got this thing, it's like, oh, how to make that argument, and you kind of define an argument, whereas we have the joy of being able to sort of pick and choose our battles. So this idea of outside game, and I think to the people who've been to Good Ancestors events, and I see a bunch of you, like I think that this responding to solicited consultations is a particularly powerful thing for us to do. Generating media is like another one that's particularly important. I know that when I was working in a minister's office, the first thing that would happen every morning is you get your media clips, which were sent by a company, and you'd sort of say, where was my minister mentioned in the papers this morning, right? What do I need to tell my minister that she might be doorstopped on this morning, like what a journalist asks when she's arriving in the building. Like the ministers super duper care about their name being mentioned in the media. So if we can mention a minister's name in association with an issue that we care about in the media, then the minister's going to care about that issue, and they're going to start thinking, oh, I'm going to have a position on that. What am I going to say? And then there's this idea of inside games, that is directly talking to members of parliament or senators or public servants. I guess if you want to imagine that, if you sort of think of those West Wing episodes, maybe like the demographic here isn't necessarily too young to be West Wing, but the idea of the 10 minutes talking to the president about the issue, that's kind of what we mean by inside game. And yeah, if we can coordinate in such a way that we bring all of these three things together in the same place at the same time, our prospect of having policy change is really genuine. Like we can make a difference by doing this in a coordinated fashion. So I'm going to run through the three projects that I think sort of give an example of this and sort of talk about the impact that we've achieved using this model today, right? So the Disaster Ready Fund. So like, what topic has the biggest impact? Like, what's that first question? So this graph is Good Ancestors research, and it's trying to show various disaster types and the expected harm that's linked to those. So this is measured in lives lost, because that's like where the most reliable data is in the historic record. You could probably do this in QALYs instead, which would make a better measure, but the data's a little bit ropier, so it's like rough as a heuristic. And you can also do it in like economic damage if you wanted, which again would be harder to measure, maybe show something different. But I think in terms of like a rough heuristic, I think that this is about right for this kind of purpose, right? So if you sort of think about the top here, you've got these kinds of disasters, the ones that we see every year, the one that the ministers are focused on, the one that's in the media, the one that the public's aware of. But the expected harm of these disasters, like although they're tragic, is not very large, right? So I put in ladders there as like a data point to contextualize that. So fires, floods, and storms combined don't have the same damage as ladders. Of course, if you started calculating like property damage, like that might switch a little bit, but this is the order of magnitude we're talking about. And as you come into volcanic eruptions and pandemics, you find these things that are dramatically larger than these disasters. The road toll, I think, is an interesting data point. The road toll is maybe higher than many of us would expect. Like that's a terrifyingly large number. But government is spending many billions of dollars to manage that road toll at Commonwealth and state and territory levels. And then we come through to things like nuclear war and other sort of like genuinely catastrophic and existential events that are really sort of just blowing out the order of magnitude from the other kind of topics, right? So if we so what does that mean? So I think this is how the average emergency manager in Australia sees disaster risk, right? So they kind of agree that a storm that happens in the middle of nowhere doesn't have a lot of consequence and doesn't have a lot of med risk and isn't worth worrying about. So that's fine. But as you get to these sort of like fires, floods, and storms that happen most years, like this is where they're imagining most of the risk lifts, right? It's in this section of the graph. And this is where most of the spending is. So government's spending like well over $10 million to try and make this bit of the graph come down. They think that's where they can have a big impact. And then their view is like, as you come across to these catastrophic disasters like nuclear war, it's not that there's no spending there, like there's a small team in DFAT who kind of sometimes thinks about these sorts of issues. There's a team in Bureau of Meteorology, like a few $1 million that gets spent on monitoring space weather, but like it's always completely ineffective at this end of the spectrum. And they think that's fine, because like nuclear wars just seem so enormously unlikely to them, it's just like not worth worrying about, is sort of the intuitive flavor that you get, and that justifies how spending is occurring. So this is what at Good Ancestors we think the risk actually looks like, and this is sort of a stylized version of that graph we saw in the previous slide. Like we think that, like, although these events are awful and they happen many years, like they just don't really add up. That even though they happen every year, you multiply it by 10, this is a very large number. Whereas these risks, although they're rare, because their orders of magnitude more consequential, their rarity doesn't mean that their risk is low. So we think if we can persuade government to move just like some of the spending here, that we could dramatically reduce the overall risk and the sort of existential implications of that. So this is an Andrew Leigh quote. I think he said basically the same thing last night. So he's talking like a little bit differently here, because he's talking about species ending, so not just catastrophic, like he's talking about the hard edge of the line. And it's really interesting that he's using the rotor again as a sort of a data point. But that sort of supports my contention that the bottom of the graph is sort of more what the world looks like. So that takes us through to the disaster ready fund, right? So the second question we're asking is there a policy window? So why there's a policy window here is that the Liberal government has set up this $5 billion fund to recover from disasters. And then despite Black Summer and despite COVID, they've spent near enough to $0 of that $5 billion. And that was like great for the Labor Party in the election campaign to say, hey, Liberals, like we've been hit by all of these disasters, you've done nothing. What we're going to do is we're going to actually spend this funding, we're going to use it to prevent disasters, everything's going to be great, which was good political arguments. Good political arguments in the election, and so they made that promise. And that comes through to like, can we be a significant voice in the conversation, right? So we engaged on this issue when the bill was referred to committee in Parliament. We talked to people on the crossbenches about how the bill could be shaped, and then we talked, including through community activation, about how the department implementing the fund could shape the way that the guidance material for it worked. And there's follow-up on that required, right? So these issues don't, like, being persistent is really important. If government imagines that you can be ignored and you'll go away, then they're much more likely to ignore you. But if you're the kind of person who's coming back and coming back and coming back on the same issues, eventually kind of like listening to you is going to be easier for them than ignoring you. So we're still following up on this issue, which is what this is about. So I think just a few days ago, this consultation closed and we've done some more work around this to sort of keep sending these messages to government about catastrophic risk. So what was the impact here, right? So I think many people will know that we've successfully persuaded government to include catastrophic natural disasters in that process. So it was likely to be the case that none of this $5 billion was going to be spent on these causes. And now it's likely that sort of millions of dollars or some amount of money is going to flow from that fund. So this is sort of like a bit of the inside map here, right? So that campaign cost us about $25,000 to run. So that was some travel, some hotels, some time to do all of the advocacy material. So sort of doing some thinking on that, like if even 0.1% of that money, so $1 in 1,000 goes to the kinds of causes that we're after, that will be a tenfold magnification of our investment in that. And that's over a single year, right? So the idea of this $5 billion fund is that it kind of earns in interest roughly what it costs to pay out. So this fund in theory operates on a perpetual basis. So even if we get 0.1% of the funding for 1 year, we will have 10x our impact, right? And so it's plausible if you sort of think into a longer term, and maybe we do better than 0.1%, that maybe we're 1,000-folding the impact of this kind of advocacy, which is sort of a really great return. And then there's this point that like, if you get more than money here, right? So if you got a successful grant up to a sort of aligned organization to do something with government, you're not just getting money to do a project, you're agreeing to do a joint project with government, right? So you're not just getting funding to write a catastrophic disaster plan, you're getting government funding to write government's catastrophic disaster plan, right? And that's impact that no amount of money can buy. So project 2 is this idea of philanthropy reform. So that first question again, what topics have the biggest impact? So Australians donate about $13 billion to charity each year. And by my counting, about 1% of that $13 billion goes to what you might call high impact charities. So you can have a great argument about like where precisely that line should be drawn. I think I've been like relatively generous in that 1%. I suspect if a hard-nosed person in this room did this maths themselves, they might come up with a number much smaller than that, but that's okay. And so current Australian charity law doesn't allow tax deduction for most high impact forest areas, right? So the suffering of animals, you can only have this tax deduction if you're sort of hands-on helping an injured animal. If you're trying to address animal suffering in a sort of systematic way, it doesn't count. You don't get the tax deduction. Future generations don't count. So Luke will know that at Effective Action in Australia, there's like a specific rule that says you can only provide like health and poverty relief to like existing people. Like you could be at a point and say, Sarah, it's Sarah's benefit that we're giving to her. If Sarah's going to be born in 10 years from now, no, you can't do that. Explain that to me. And then this idea is catastrophic and accidental disasters, right? So you can be a bushfire charity, no worries, but if you want to be like a stop nuclear war charity, you're not welcome inside the tax deduction block. So unbelievable. So this sucks because it's really hard to raise funds as a charity that doesn't have this DGR status. People want to make donations to tax locals charities, like rather than just like donating 20% less and ending up in the same place, like it's a psychological hurdle. And there's also a credibility point, right? Like you kind of get this blessing of government to join the top tier of charity land. And if these clauses don't have it, it's sort of implied that government thinks these things are a little bit less valuable. So let's give a little case study of that. So ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, as we probably know, they received their Nobel Peace Prize for their work, but they don't have this tax deductible status, which is so you can become a charity, right? Like a mere charity if you meet this definition of compliance and security of Australians by doing a bunch of stuff. So ICAN meets this requirement, like they're a charity, but they don't get this tax deductible status because they're not maintaining the recreation of members of the armed forces or reconstructing war memorials, right? So it just seems bizarre. It's super bizarre to me that, like, you know, if we lived in small town Australia, you know, we could start a little charity where we repair the little war memorial on the roundabout and collect money at the pub, and that would be legit. But like, if you want to stop a nuclear holocaust, like, you know, weapons so much. So is there a policy window? So government, again, in the context of the election campaign, made this commitment to double philanthropic giving, and they referred this matter to the Productivity Commission to conduct this inquiry. Consultations open in March. The final report comes down to government next year. So this is exactly the kind of opportunity where government's saying, like, hey, what are your views on this question, right? So they're like openly open the policy window to our views, and then we get to do democracy as it's intended to be done. Yeah, so can we be a significant voice in the conversation? So talk about 3 streams of work. So the first stream of work is this idea of charities for impact. So this is a brand that we created. We wrote a sort of a 2-page letter. It's quite high level. It sets out the arguments. And then we talked to a whole bunch of high impact charities around Australia and sort of got them to co-sign this letter. So the good thing about this is that it definitely gets into the radar of the commission because they see a brand, they see a whole bunch of reputable charities, and they listen to what this might mean. And it also gives us a book for media, right? Because we can then talk to journalists and say, like, hey, did you hear about charities of impact? All of these people, they've written this letter, here's the context of it. And that media contributes to that outside game idea, right? And then there's these community workshops. So this is a screen grab from the website of the Productivity Commission. It's about, like, if you go through the hundreds of submissions they've received, and it's about 20% of all submissions were received from people in this community, which makes us by far the largest, like, slice of the pie chart, raising these ideas. And then Good Ancestors worked with Effective Action Australia to produce a sort of 30-odd page submission where we unpack these ideas in detail and we sort of really showed the research behind the arguments. The idea being that if the Productivity Commission sees something in one of these documents and it's like, hey, that's an interesting idea, where can I read more about that? There's like a much more detailed document that they can open up and see the citations, footnotes, and arguments and research that sits behind it. So what's the impact of this? So as I said before, we're still a little while away from reporting, so who knows if we've been successful in getting the changes that we want. But if we're currently donating $13 billion to charity, that's about $130 million that's flowing to the kind of high impact charities. And, you know, as you know, high impact charities might be getting sort of 10 or 100 times more impact per dollar than average charities. So if government's successful in doubling charity, like that's the stated goal of government, and they listen to our recommendations to let these high impact charities into the DGR classification, and that like doubles their share from 1% to 2%, maybe if they guess, maybe you could do better than that. That's a starting point. That would mean $390 million per year going to high impact charities from that change. So to give some context on that, the work of Effective Action Australia and Life You Can Save, from the day they were both created to today, has raised about $44 million. So a single year of this change would be like a 9-fold increase in all of that effort since they were created. So like the numbers we're talking about here in policy land are big, and that's why I think this work is important. So AI safety. So I don't really want to argue about like why AI safety is impactful. I've put EY on the slide here. It's like a great doomer phrase. And like maybe there's some hardcore doomers at this conference, or maybe there's people who are like a little bit more chill, but a little bit worried. And I think you can go to Zan's talk tomorrow, I think, if you want to have that argument, but I think that there's definitely something to be worried about, like wherever you are on that spectrum, whether it's sort of more of an ethical concern or existential concern, there's something to worry about with AI. Again, is there a policy window? So the same thing, government sort of asks this question to the public, which gives us the window to respond. And one of the problems here is that government seems to be just stubborn on refusing to talk about these existential and catastrophic risks. Like they just want the economy stuff to go really well, and then they want to address like the ethical and trust issues only insofar as it means people actually use AI to make use of money for government. Like that's the fairly staunch outlook that they have. And New South Wales Parliament is running a similar consultation right now. So I think it's about 12 o'clock this afternoon at lunchtime. I'll be running a quick workshop to do exactly this, to help people write responses to the New South Wales Parliament to talk about how they can shape AI policy in Australia. So can we be a significant voice in the conversation? So again, we've done the exact same three-limbed argument, right? So we've done this co-signed letter, this time signed by AI safety experts in Australia. This was like terrifically successful. So we got coverage in The Australian, we got coverage in The Guardian. I gave several interviews on ABC News talking about these issues, and many of the experts who signed the letter also got sort of interviews to talk about their expertise. So it was like a great media hit. And like the reason that matters is because like when I was on the ABC News, they were like, yes, and we're talking to Minister Husick's office about this letter and what the implications mean and what it's going to do, right? So we know for absolute certain that this letter went across to Minister Husick's desk. We ran these community workshops again. So there's a photo from Canberra of a packed Whole Foods with people on laptops working on these submissions, which is great. And we, again, wrote a detailed submission from Good Ancestors that sort of unpacks these arguments in more detail. So what we're arguing, and again, like the Zan talk tomorrow is where you want to be to hear these arguments in more detail, but we argue that Australia must first acknowledge that these risks are real things. We argue that Australia, using its power in international governance, can have a meaningful impact on these causes. We argued that government should be working to prevent risks across the spectrum. So we think government should be worrying about these near-term risks. These ethical concerns are real. Racist and sexist AIs are a real problem, and they should address them. But also they should be thinking about these misuse risks, like can powerful AI increase the likelihood of terrorists and allow for election disruption? And then at the extreme edge, like is government, is AI a potential existential risk, and can we start doing things to tackle that risk as well? So dear government, there's like three kinds of problems, we should address all three of them. And then finally, that we should get more skills into government so we can understand these issues better. So what's the impact of this? So we're not talking dollars here necessarily in the same way we were with the other two scenarios. So what this is trying to talk about is like how the conversation is working. So government has kind of like asked this question and sort of asked feedback, and we're kind of injecting into the conversation this thing is blue, right? So we know there's people in the Australian community talking about this idea. They're kind of saying like, AI should be accelerated, we should fix of AI, it's going to be great, everything's going to be fine. And we know that there's this view out there as well, that AI should be responsible and we should worry about ethical concerns. And we're trying to add in this additional view to that conversation that AI could be extremely powerful and could have these like more serious risks that we need to be mitigating, right? So then as the conversation progresses, the government goes into designing these policies, and we can have these sort of inside game conversations. Government, I probably can't talk about it too much in this forum, but like absolutely we're now having closed-door meetings with government to talk about AI safety, which is terrifically exciting. And overall that like increases the chance that things are going to go well on AI because of this work. So look, what's happening below the waterline? So this is kind of outside game stuff. Like this is all the stuff we've done publicly with the community as part of like that coordinated free-com strategy. But there's a lot of effort going as well behind the scenes, right? Like things where we don't have a public sort of face to it, right? And so a whole bunch of organizations have been working with and a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to run through every point on this slide, but if there's something there that jumps out to you and you want to ask a question about it, you're welcome to. But I will just mention briefly as an example, like Kevin, the point in orange. So again, this is not something that we've talked about before, but Kevin might mention it, nod or shake at your presentation tomorrow.
I'm hoping you're going to be in the Q&A.
We can talk about it. Okay, so very briefly, the idea here is that, so AllFed, that's what I met Kevin, the Alliance to Beat the Earth and Disasters, a food security organization, has been preparing these sort of government response plans in the event of an abrupt sunlight reduction scenario. So this is sort of a nuclear war or like a large volcanic eruption that causes like real risk to food security. And so the idea is that if a government kind of like understands how to respond to those things, like rather than Australians being in a famine, we could be in a position where Australia, by making some adjustments to how we grow crops, could actually continue to export a huge amount of calories into the region during one of these disasters. So that would have like an enormous impact on the ability to stabilize. And without being mean to Kevin, I think we've been struggling to get traction in countries like the US, sort of with these plans and getting them to sort of like listen to these ideas. Whereas in Australia, like because of Good Ancestors working with ORFED, we've managed to craft these plans in such a way that they make sense in the Australian environment. Like we understand how Australian disaster governance works, and we can create plans that sort of match up one-to-one with how Australia's thinking about the problems. And then we've gone to meetings with the various arms of government that are responsible for these disasters. We've printed out copies of the plan. We've sat in the rooms where a nuclear war would be managed. And we've said, here's a version, let's put that in your safe. Thank you very much. So that if there is a nuclear war, we know the emergency managers are going to be sitting in that room. They know they're going to think like, oh crap, there was that weird conversation with Greg and Kev. Like, what should we do? There was that document, happy days. And then if they sort of follow that plan, and they've got no other plans, so why wouldn't they? That could result in just an enormous number of lives being saved through food exports into the region. So it's just one of the things we've done through pure inside gain without the efforts of the community that I think is terrifically impactful.
And come tomorrow at 12:15 to hear even more.
Absolutely. I think there's also an exercise being run about a similar topic. If you want to plug yourself, Dan.
Yeah, come back as well. Yeah, we're simulating that whole process. 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Yeah, awesome. So Project 4, ? So government just 2 days ago announced an inquiry into COVID, a long time coming. Pandemic's obviously one of the biggest risks facing humanity, both naturally occurring and engineered. These kind of inquiries, like this is the moment where government's saying like, what's the future going to look like? We need to be preparing. And the announcement was like quite open-ended, right? Like they're asking about the future. So this is our chance to advocate for pandemic prevention, which is exciting. Policy development's underway at Chelsea, doing terrific work to make sure that we've got the evidence-based arguments that we need. And so this is absolutely the kind of thing we'll activate the community about. So if you're a group leader or otherwise interested, stay in touch, and we'll absolutely be doing events around this in the immediate term. So before I go to questions, 3 points, right? So how can you help? So this community point is absolutely essential, right? So if you're not a member of your local group or you're not sort of in touch with your local group, you really should be. I know that I only got in touch with my local group about a year ago, and that was probably a mistake. So at least be on their Facebook group or their mailing list so you can be in touch with them. And then when there's gap events come, it's like an opportunity for impact that has sort of like no counterfactual cost to you, right? Like I'm not asking you to do something like different with your career. I'm asking you to spend like an hour or two doing something, right? Get in touch with me. So I'm happy to talk about like any kind of policy issue. We were just chatting about a policy issue before. So if you have ideas about policy, I'm interested. If you work in policy, I'm also interested in chatting to you. And like I absolutely understand the pressures of working inside government and having to be kind of like a political representative. Like so I get that. And I'm also happy to talk about policy careers with people and how to get these kind of careers happening. You can hit me via email or grab me on LinkedIn. And then the other point is donations, right? So goodancestors.org/policy. Yeah, so policy ultimately I think is neglected. Like it's just not something that's happening enough of, given the scale of it. And it's hardly leveraged, right? Like I think if you look at the dollars I've been talking about in those previous slides, like the cost of running these organizations, the potential for impact is really a very, very long lever. And these ideas are just like neglected by institutional funders, right? So when we go to the wealthy Americans and say, hey, can we have some money for this? They sort of say, I mean, policy sounds like a little bit weird, like it's not like the center of the bullseye for us. And then they say like, in Australia sounds like a little bit weird, a little bit small, a little bit far away. Like, how do you relate to AI? Like, I don't know. And so when those two kind of like ho-hums come together, it means that it's like next to impossible for us to get these sorts of grants from the big EA funders. So if we're not supported by small donors in Australia, this work will absolutely not continue. And then the cost here is like extremely low. So like you as an individual donor could decide whether or not this kind of work continues happening in Australia, like in a really realistic way. So if you're interested in donating, like I'm really happy to talk to you. And you can obviously go to the website if you'd like to do that directly, but it does make just like a truly enormous difference to the organisation. So that's it from me. Happy to take any questions with the remaining time.
Thanks, everyone. We've only got 5 minutes of questions, but Greg will be at office hours tomorrow at 11 o'clock. If you've got more questions, go find him there.
Yeah, I'm also free for kind of the next half hour. So,
Awesome. Yeah, cool. One of the ones got coming up here is Sean spending over a decade in government. Do you have any ideas about how like a non-public servant could start to build an understanding of how government works? And maybe also more broadly, what skills people could be working on investing in this kind of area?
yeah. Yeah, so how do you learn about this issue, right? So I think it's not as mysterious as you might imagine. Like the point, like there's idea of open government, right? Where government is sort of saying like, hey, we want the public to be involved. So I guess there is sort of these sort of like internal machinations that take like a fair bit to learn about. But I think like the overall idea that there's sort of systems of government and that they want to hear your views is not terribly complicated. I think like knowing where your skills are is particularly important here. So like if you've got views on like biosecurity, or if you've got views on, you know, economics or whatever it might be, like understanding like that particular area of government is helpful. So I guess like one place to start might be just like stalking the org chart of the area that's of interest to you. So if you care about health, just spend like 10 minutes going to Department of Health org chart Google and just like looking at that document and seeing how it's structured and like what areas of responsibility look like. And I think that will start to give a bit of a sense about how it works. Otherwise, talk to me. I'm happy to share.
Cool, thanks. And it sounds like there's some of these policy windows that are open. The government will ask for submissions, that's really clear. Are there ever subtler signs that policy windows are opening, and if there are, what do you mean?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I've been terribly impressed by with some other organizations doing is kind of like seeing policy windows as election commitments and managing to sort of get parties to sort of say like, here's our policy on something so that you can kind of have a government make an election commitment. Because if you think of some of those policy windows, like we've been exploiting election commitments rather than creating them. So I think there is something that kind of like larger and sophisticated organizations can achieve in that space and kind of see the possibility of government making a change on something and like why it might be, why that party might see that it's in its sort of tactical or strategic interest to make that change, and then sort of like working a little bit more, which is like terrific. I don't think that we're quite at the scale to do that yet. So we're really looking for those like super overt policy windows where we can just like walk straight in the front door. There is like more and better, but we're just not quite ready for that. And like props to the organizations well.
How much funding do you guys need to continue?
So we're trying to raise $10,000 a month. If we have $10,000 a month in recurring donations, I think we can keep going. If we can't make $10,000 a month in recurring donations, we're going to get kind of desperate. So whatever, $110,000 a year. And our sort of thinking is that should keep us afloat with our current runway to keep functioning until like maybe the donation environment improves or we have some better idea. So $10,000 a month in recurring donations is like the number, which I guess like maybe sounds like a lot, but maybe doesn't sound like a lot as well. Like if you think about like Effective Action Australia, we're turning over like $5 million a year, $100,000 a year, it would be amazing.
Other than coming to your sessions, is there capacity for people to volunteer with you guys?
Yeah. So that's something that we're interested in. There's some like logistical things behind the scenes that are challenging with volunteers. Like we have to have like liability insurance and these kinds of things that are sort of challenging to navigate and also expensive. And so when we look into balance sheet, like, you know, paying $2,000 for liability insurance starts to become a pain. So like, that's like a little bit hard at the moment, but like working on policy development stuff is like super great. So there's a few people in the community who I know, like on the biosecurity front specifically, have been looking, like just community members who are excited about this opportunity. And so if people can like help us write and think, that's like really powerful. So if you've got an expertise or an interest, even like an undergrad degree in these kinds of topics that we're talking about, like absolutely reach out to me and we can talk. I sort of dream of a future where we could be like ICANN and have that kind of like band advocate idea, like, you know, an advocate for the future or something like that. And maybe that's a space we can get into, but we're just not quite ready there.
Yeah, cool. It's our time. What's the West Wing relevant to your career decisions?
Yeah, I mean, probably not, but gee, it was like great TV. And so like maybe it did make me think about like the world of policy. I think it's like cynicism, I think, is like one of the main issues, right? So I think cynicism of like policy and politics is like so pervasive now in a way that it just wasn't when West Wing was on. And when you rewatch West Wing, it's kind of like it was already like a little bit rose tinted glasses when it was aired, and now it's just like deep cringe for how rose tinted glasses is. But like I guess if you took a message away from this, like you don't need to be as cynical about politics and policy as some of the modern media is pitching it. Like the world is like a little bit more West Wingy than you might worry that it is. So like there is real people. Like, I mean, talking to the public servants, I didn't get into this much, but they really care about this stuff. Like they do care. They want to be doing policy that thinks more about the long term. Like they want to be doing evidence-based policy. Like public service people like with really similar values to us. So the cynicism is like it's there, but it's nowhere near as deep as you might worry about.
Awesome. Thanks very much.